Hello, Stitchers. Welcome to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. I'm your host, Lisa Woolfork. I'm a fourth-generation sewing enthusiast with more than 20 years of sewing experience. I am looking forward to today's conversation, so sit back, relax, and get ready to get your stitch together.
Hey friends, hey, it's Lisa from Black Women Stitch and the Stitch Please podcast. And as I say every other week, this is a very special episode because this episode is going to talk about vocabulary to help your sewing. You've seen terms like warp, weft, and maybe you've said to yourself, WTF? What do these things mean? Why does this even matter? So I'm going to say that sewing vocabulary is useful and important to a variety of degrees. I think that understanding just some fundamental basics of the vocabulary of textiles can be very helpful to avoid some problems that might happen in your garments, for example, that will cause you the blues later on. So this is what we're going to talk about today, how things like warp, weft, and 7 other key terms that every sewer should know that can help your sewing. We're going to start with warpan, the Old English term, and it meant to throw, cast, turn, or wind. And these are the lengthwise threads that run parallel to the selvage. Now, that's the lengthwise. It means that the threads there are stronger, they're more stable because they're held under tension during the weaving process. And it's often used as the vertical direction of garments. So if you've seen your sewing machine, your sewing patterns, and there's a long arrow along that line, that is helping to track the warp of the fabric. And these lengthwise sections stretch less, they sag less, they hold their shape better. It's really good for pants, coats, jackets, all of those things that you want to kind of hang nicely. In addition, even for knit fabrics, it also applies that the way that, warp and weft will work for this as well. When you are sewing underwear, for example, and bras, you want to have what's called the greatest degree of stretch. That is what they call the DOGS, is degree of greatest stretch. I was spelling DOSCS, child. Anyways, let's think about DOGS, which is the degree of greatest stretch. And it's also important because that was going to take us to the weft. The transition from thinking about the knit fabric warp will take us to weft. Weft is the first that was recorded around the same time as the word warp was recorded, but it is from Weft, and it means crosswise threads woven over and under the warp threads. This one runs selvage to selvage. It runs from selvage to selvage. And if you lay your fabric flat on the ground, for example, and you see one selvage to your right or left or one selvage on the top and the bottom, when you try to connect those threads, you are connecting those weft threads. It often has more give than warp threads, and this is how it helps your sewing. Knowing where the weft is can help you get garments that are going to be comfortable, more easeful, and have more movement. If you have something that has side-to-side body movement, that's something that the weft fibers can help you with. Now, in knit fabrics, many have like I said, the DOGS, degree of greatest stretch, is across the width. It's across the width, those 2 different selvages. You got one selvage here, you've got one selvage here. And across those 2 things, that is going to be your greatest degree of stretch for a knit fabric. Or you want to test it to make sure it is. And that's something that you're going to want for your bras, something you're going to want for your underwear. You want it to, that's something you're going to want for your bras. That's something you're going to want for your underwear. At least I want it. I want it to be able to stretch around the bootay and be comfortable. Now, I started talking about selvage, which makes me think that I should have maybe started with the word selvage. But you know what? We're here now. And I'm pretty sure you can totally keep up. Selvage is a great word. Selvage is spelled in two different ways. One way is Selvage, and the other way is exactly like the first way, but it has a D in toward the end, and that's Selvedge. Now, word nerds to the front. If you are a word nerd, I'm talking to you, raise your hand, come sit next to me. You are going to freak out, okay? Did you know that the word selvage is a portmanteau, right? It's a portmanteau. I know, it's so satisfying. It is a portmanteau. Now, for those of you all who aren't word nerds, a portmanteau is a word that is created from two words sounded together. If there's a phrase, for example, two words that get said together a lot, you can kind of mush all the sounds together. And when that works effectively, people will make a new word. For an example of a portmanteau is brunch. There's breakfast and lunch. You put together what's between breakfast and lunch. You take the brunch, and now we got brunch. So that's a portmanteau we use all the time. I, for example, did not know that the word motel was a portmanteau. And that's, I guess, portmanteau, it stood in for motor hotel. So if you're driving along, and this is, motor travel was much more popular before air travel even existed. So there was a lot of roadside motor hotels or hotels for motorists. I never thought about the difference between a motel and a hotel. I wonder if hotel's a portmanteau. Ooh, I just thought of a really naughty portmanteau of what it could be for. Motor hotel. What could a hotel be for? Anyway, hoes got to eat too. What we're actually talking about is selvage today. And the portmanteau of selvage is self-edge. Self-edge. And the first recorded use of self-edge or selvage is Middle English, 14th century use. Now, before we were talking about 1000 CE, now we're moving way, way forward into the 14th century in Middle English. And this is the fabric's own finished edge, the way that the fabric has edged itself, the fabric's self edge. And it's something it weaves itself during the manufacturing process. Now, the two modern spellings of this, Selvage, which I've been told is the more American spelling, and Selvegge, that is the more English spelling. And I like how it keeps edge in the portmanteau. So essentially the British version essentially uses the exact word self-edge, but it changes the F into a V. It can also help you to remember what selvage is. It's the self-edge of a fabric. And what's useful about it is it's a really crucial identification of fabric. And once you can identify it, it's in woven. When you're looking at woven material, a selvage is created when the weft turns back during the weaving. So remember, we had the warp threads that were long, and then the weft goes like through it like this. I'm waving. I'm doing my hands like this for people on the Patreon. Okay. Like a wave. That's how they're doing. Gosh, I look really good doing that. Maybe I should think about becoming like someone that does this like this. I should probably not. I'm also probably moving a bit too much, but it has to turn around. And when it turns around, that little loop that it makes on the turn becomes the self-edge, the selvage. And it's also important for knits as well, that I have fabric that I use, like a wonderful ponte or cotton lycra, and you can tell the edge of the fabric will feel different from the actual fabric itself. Now, this is how it helps your sewing. Selvages help identify the lengthwise direction quickly, so you can put your pattern pieces easily or accurately. So you will often see the instruction fold selvage to selvage. If you don't know where the selvages are or what a selvage is, that will put you at a disadvantage. And so this is one of the reasons why it's useful to know what this term means. Similarly, what's also important is the the ways that the selvages can help shape the directions of your projects. For example, when I'm cutting fabric, I always make sure to cut selvage to selvage across the selvage. I never want to cut the selvage of a fabric off because I want to know which way it should go. And it's very frustrating. Sometimes I buy a lot of scraps. Okay. I buy a lot of scraps and sometimes I'll pull out a piece and I'm like, what is this? What direction was this meant to go? I'll wash it. And then when I look at it again, I'm like, oh, okay. I think the selvage is here because of how it's curling in. And so the selvage becomes a good way for you to know what the right or, and by right, I mean how you can follow the pattern instructions. That's what it did. The selvage can help you follow the pattern instructions to get good results for your sewing. So selvages can also be good for telling the right versus wrong side of a fabric because during the manufacturing process, little holes get made in pinning the fabric to the machinery, I suppose. And sometimes I've seen fabrics that if you want to know, if I need to know where the right or the wrong side of a fabric is, child, I just decide. I choose. I'm like, I like this one. This will be my right side versus their right side. But if you want to know what the manufacturer believes the right side of the fabric is, you can use the selvage to find that detail because the right side of the selvage will be smooth, while the wrong side of the selvage will have a puncture hole from where the fabric was held in. And that is one way that I often tell, especially when both sides of a solid fabric look similar. And that's especially useful for knit fabrics. Like I love a cotton lycra, but I'm able to tell what the right side versus the wrong side is because I can see the little knit marks by looking at the weft of the fabric on top. And then when I flip it over, the back looks different than the front. And it's very, very small micro differences that no one would notice but me. But it's something that I pay attention to because I know that I want to have a certain look or a certain outcome. Now, there's also some creative uses for selvages, and I collect them to document my sewing. Actually, I have a big bag of them stapled to the wall of my studio, a huge bag. And when I find an interesting selvage or a cool selvage or a selvage that has something interesting, I put it in this bag. And one day, I am going to fabricate all those selvages. I am going to sew all of those selvages together, either onto a foundation or just sew them all together one after the other just for my own interests. And then you'll see that I did it. Yes, yes. I have a feeling I know I have so many selvages that I have saved, but because they're so cool. Like several fabric companies reprint selvages as fabrics. And they do that so that you can buy a fabric that looks like pieced selvages, sometimes from their own collection, sometimes from someone else's. And I know some of the selvages that I've saved that I've loved, like from Rashida Coleman Hale, from her line. Ruby Star Society in general has really great and very collectible selvages. And I think they even did a collection around some of their old selvages at one point. Like it's a really fun thing. Now, the next term I want to talk about, and it connects very well to selvage, and that is grain. You might have heard people talk about the grain of a fabric. I'm going to tell you what that is and why that matters. The first recorded use of the word grain was in the 13th century. It was written in textile and material context. It's Latin. It comes from granum, which means seed or kernel. And it was later used to mean a repeated structure or a direction. So you might have heard go against the grain as someone who goes against the repeated structure or direction. Now, grain here means fabric direction or orientation. Now, in wovens, the grain is based on warp and weft thread directions. In knits, it refers to how fabric can stretch directionally and for a stretch behavior in general. And you don't often think about grain with knits, but it is a way to understand that the selvages are trying to give you advice. And the selvages that we just talked about a second ago are also parallel with that warp fabric, which is also the grain line. And this is why knowing the term grain helps your sewing. If you can connect grain to selvage, knowing that to go along the grain is to go along the selvage, and to go across the grain is to go across the selvages, that's two basic things that will help you very much with all of your future projects, because it'll help you understand why the directions are asking you to do the things they're asking you to do. So grain determines how a garment fits, how it hangs, if it twists or not, how it moves on the body. Pants cut off grain do not hang right, no matter how much you press them. That coat that you spent 40 hours making, and by you, I mean me, Lisa, it will be jacked up in the back for all eternity. Yes, it will. It'll be jacked up in the back for all eternity, just like my coat, because I apparently cut it off grain. I might have been playing pattern Jenga, which we'll talk about at the end of this episode. But yeah, I messed it up myself, and no amount of pressing is going to make that no longer a thing. And this is going to help us turn to straight grain versus cross grain. Now, the straight grain is the true lengthwise direction of the fabric. It runs parallel to the selvage. It usually follows the warp threads. And you will also see in knit fabrics that the patterns will still include grain line arrows, because they want to show you the right lengthwise placement of your pattern pieces. Now, knowing the grain, the straight grain, or things on the straight of grain, helps keep long seams vertical. So here's how it helps your sewing. The straight of grain, when you cut garments along the straight of grain, it keeps those long seams vertical. You might have seen pants that you try to get a nice strong crease in the front, or especially if you have a cuff and you want that pant leg to kind of hang in a certain way. I've even seen some patterns where they stitch an eighth of an inch seam allowance right along the front to keep that long seam vertical and to have it stand out as a design element. If those pants are cut cross grain, or if those pants are not cut on the straight of grain, they will not work. That little crease in the front is going to be like meow, it's not going to work. Straight of grain helps to keep your hems level so that your hems don't like dip or sag, which can happen if the garment is cut off grain. And it helps keep the balance of the body on the body overall, which is why they put it there, because that's the most stable. So pants, legs, coat fronts, dresses, sleeves, all of those things are cut on the grain for a reason. Now, cross grain, also something that you can use strategically. And it's the direction that crosses the lengthwise grain. So if you imagine the letter T, this center beam in the T is the lengthwise grain. This is a lowercase t we're talking about. The lowercase crosses it perpendicularly, and that is the crosswise grain. That's the one that's tracking those weft fibers. and it runs perpendicular to the selvage, usually, again, selvage to selvage. In knits, this is also important, as I said before, about the greatest degree of stretch. So this is why it's important for the dogs. The degree of greatest stretch. That's the dogs. Degree of greatest stretch. And that is the cross grain. And if you know where the cross grain is, it's going to make it that much easier when you're cutting out your bra pieces, when you're cutting out your undies. All of this is really helpful. And it's also important to know that the pattern directions are not just messing with you, that they are asking you to lay these things out in a particular way to generate a particular outcome. The last term I'm going to discuss is something you've heard of and probably even used, and that is bias. And that actually is from French, Old French, bias or B-I-A-I-S, which means slant or diagonal. And the 16th century English used it as well, but I love how that comes from the French. That's interesting to me. Now, the bias, or what's called the true bias, is 45 degrees. And that's the diagonal direction, which is 45 degrees to the warp and weft in woven fabric. That has the greatest degree of stretch and drape. So you might see, for example, if you're working on a drapey gown or dress or something like that, rather than having you have the arrow, that grain line arrow, be parallel to the selvage, you rotate it 45 degrees and it's at a perpendicular angle to that selvage. In knits, diagonal cutting can change stretch, but you can also do some really fun things using stripes and playing with that stripe direction. And that can be a strategic use, and you can absolutely use bias strategically. Bias is the reason we have bias tape. I think that bias is fun to think about because it shows that even when a fabric is woven, a very firm, hard quilting cotton, for example, that's very tightly woven. When you cut it on the true bias, you will get a lot of stretch, you'll get a lot of drape, a lot of movement. And this is why people tend to like it for quilt bindings. It's also great as a substitute for facings. I use bias binding for all manner of decorative purposes on woven garments. And it is a fun thing to make as well. Now, it helps your sewing because the way that it can be useful, the bias itself for drapey fabrics, really great design effects, and to just remind us that there's a lot of movement built into fabrics that aren't even designed to stretch. And that's what bias teaches us. So we've gone through some of the major terms for just basic textile vocabulary, looking at warp, weft, selvage, cross grain, straight of grain, bias, and grain. So now there's terms that you might not have heard of before. Maybe you've heard of them and you weren't sure what they were, or maybe you're being affirmed in your knowledge today, and yay, I love that. The slogan of the Stitch Please podcast is that we'll help you get your stitch together. And I think the advice I'll have for the Get Your Stitch Together episode today is that pattern Jenga is fun, and pattern Jenga is, Molly, you in danger, girl. Because it is absolutely okay to rotate your pieces and to squeeze everything you can into limited yardage. You can totally do that. I have done that. But you've got to know the trade-offs. If it is a woven fabric and you are cutting things on the bias that were meant to be cut on the straight of grain, the trade-off you might have is the thing that you are trying to save money to make will not work. And that's how sometimes I find myself taking shortcuts that turn out to be expensive. Or like, oh no, I'm going to do this to save money. And it will cost you twice as much in time and effort. And so look at the layout. Think about why they've asked you to do it this way. And yes, it can be very frustrating when it seems that a pattern layout did not think about your budget. because I look at some layouts and I'm like, do you want me just to throw this all away? You should have put a hat in here or something. This is a lot of open space, you know. But I think we've got to remember that I don't think that designers are thinking about that type of efficiency as much as they're thinking about wanting garments to look a certain way. I'm not so sure. But don't create fitting problems that pressing won't fix. Because grain line is a real thing and directional fabrics are also a real thing. And this is why I wanted to go through some vocabulary today, just about things like selvage, for example. So you know where they are, what they do, and how they can help you. All of this is designed to help you get your stitch together. And these are practical tools for better sewing. And I guess I want to end and ask you, like, have you ever learned the hard way about what some of these sewing terms mean? I know for me, I totally cut that cape off grain. I loved it. The fabric was not cheap. I spent 1,000 hours on it and it didn't work. And all I could be was sad because that was my bad. Have you had experiences or errors like that? Please let us know at blackwomenstitch.org. And I'll talk with you soon. Thanks.
You've been listening to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. We appreciate you joining us this week and every week for stories that center Black women, girls, and femmes in sewing. We invite you to join the Black Women Stitch Patreon community with giving levels beginning at $5 a month. Your contributions help us bring the Stitch Please podcast to you every week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support, and come back next week and we'll help you get your stitch together.